It just didn't quite happen for Rondale Moore. He had a 1.38 odd. So it's like targets per out run was great, 25%, but it's like, does that lose some meaning when it's with a 1.38
Yes.
odd? Like,
Yeah, it does.
Welcome to another edition of Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone. If you're listening to us on YouTube, make sure you give us a like, leave a comment, helps us out a lot. And on iTunes, you can also rate and review us. That helps a ton. This offseason, going through a lot of dynasty stuff, had Anthony Amico on the podcast to look at the incoming rookie class of wide receivers. And on today's podcast, pumped to have Pat Kerrane with me to look at the year 2 wide receivers and what their fantasy value is for this season and kind of how Pat's approaching them in Dynasty. Pat, always exciting to have you back on ETE.
Yeah, it's exciting to join you. This is a fun topic. We also have some trade news to discuss once we get to the Dolphins section here. I was thankful that we had planned to talk about the second-year wide receivers. It breaks that Tyreek Hill is going to either the Jets or the Dolphins. So I'm thankful we know where he landed so that we can actually discuss that second-year wide receiver with a little bit more knowledge.
Yeah, and it's sometimes it's difficult to do like this dynasty content right now with like current year news just breaking left and right with this absolutely insane off season. But I know dynasty trades are picking up in some of my leagues, and people are getting ready for the rookie draft. So it's a good time to look at things. And Miko did a good job kind of walking us through on the last podcast, the basic things we're looking at in prospects in terms of breakout age, draft capital, athleticism, some of the production metrics. And right off the bat, before we get into all the specific year 2 receivers, I'm just curious how much do you like anchor to what you thought of these guys as prospects to what they actually did year 1 in the NFL?
I tend to look at it as like, if you kind of bucket the rookie seasons into like 3 buckets. Bucket 1 would be like Ja'Marr Chase. Like if a wide receiver who I didn't think was that great of a prospect, let's say I thought they were a straight up bad prospect and they had the season like Ja'Marr Chase just had, I would completely throw away the prospect profile. I mean, that type of season is absurd. It doesn't really matter. Now with the Ja'Marr Chase, because he was the best prospect in years, and then he has the kind of season that he did, he had built on some unsustainable yards per target efficiency, which we'll get to, but that makes me, all the more likely to buy into it. The second bucket would basically be like a stay the course type of season, which is what we got from most of the wide receivers. And, I think the season kind of moved guys up or down a little bit based on what they did as rookies, but more or less kind of stay the course. And then the third bucket would be the JJ Arcega-Whiteside bucket, where you basically are like, this guy might do something, but it won't be this year. And I think, we do have a wide receiver like that in this class, as we'll get to.
Yeah, and to help you do that, like obviously if you have a season like Chase, it almost doesn't matter what metric you look at because it was just such an insane season. But for the guys that it's a little bit more difficult to judge the success of their rookie season, what are the underlying metrics that kind of help give you a clue as to whether or not they're going to be successful in year 2?
Yeah, I think yards per out run is really good. Targets per out run is really good as well, and targets per out run is more stable than yards per out run because it doesn't include yards per target, which is a bit noisy. But I actually like yards per out run better than targets per out run for this type of valuation, because I do think that yards per target tells us something about the skill level of these players. Like, I don't think it's enough to just know how many times these guys were targeted per route. For one thing, yards per target gives us an idea of how deep downfield these guys were targeted, because yards per target is correlated with depth of target. If you're getting targeted, 15 yards downfield, you're going to get more yards per each one of those targets. So I think that's helpful. You can also look at weighted targets per out run, which Ben Gretsch came up with, and that includes the air yards in the targets per out run formula. I think that's helpful. But again, I also still would rather know, like if you could only give me one, I would take yards per target or yards per route run, because I think the yards per target is telling us 2 things. One, there's some small noisy signal about how good the player actually is, what they're doing with their targets. But I think it also does let us know what the team thought of their rookie year. Like if a player just absolutely bombed in yards per target, that could be a bad sign for their playing time going forward, for the amount of routes that they're getting. I also think just seeing how many routes they ran per game is very helpful. Certainly, if you got a small sample, it's harder to buy into extreme efficiency. We've got one of those wide receivers in this class. I think it's helpful to look at where they were playing, their average depth of target in terms of where they were seeing the targets, but also were they running out of the slot? Were they running out wide? Were they doing both? I really like when, wide receivers able to have that versatility and they're not just kind of stuck in one spot. You can also see, were they a lot more efficient doing one thing or another? Were they much better in the slot than outside or vice versa? So those are probably the main metrics that I like looking at.
Yeah. And I like doing these types of podcasts too, and these types of evaluations, because like from our perspective, doing, off-season projections that establish the run, sometimes I'm just letting like the efficiency stuff sort of just be dictated by an algorithm when there's not a huge sample size. I might be missing a little bit of signal in terms of the breakout potential for these guys. And like I'm fitting them within the context of these teams. So it's good to come at it from another angle, which is a little bit more micro, a little bit more player specific, and trying to marry the two. Last question before we get into, I mean, there's so many year two wide receivers to talk about, but I guess it's a combo question. Like how quickly are you moving on guys that flash? You answered that a little bit in your start, like with your buckets of guys, like where you bucket Chase and like that's someone you're moving fast on, but like just how quickly do you move on? And I remember when we first did it, one of our first Dynasty podcasts, we were talking about Terry McLaurin and like moving super quickly on him because he flashed in a couple games, and like tying that into how much you care about like the whole season versus someone like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who, it took him a while to carve out his role in Detroit. But then once he did, he had like 8 catches minimum in his last 6 games. Like, are you just looking at those last 6 games, or are you looking at the season in totality?
Well, one of the reasons I love looking at the routes is that like the routes are the opportunity. Like if you look at per game metrics and, the guy was on the field, but, running like 35% of the routes, that wasn't really like a game's worth of opportunity for, Amon-Ra St. Brown. If he, if a player is out there all the time and then happens to have a really hot stretch, then I think that's a lot less exciting than if they, struggled to get on the field and then got on the field and were immediately awesome. Because I think, we've seen time and time again that coaches don't always put their best players on the field. And,
yeah,
it must be a pretty difficult evaluation in practice to figure out who should actually be playing. I think the games tell you a lot more about who should be playing than practices. At least that's my perception as someone who's never had anything to do with NFL coaching. But it seems to me that it's hard to figure it out in practice, at least, perfectly. So, once a guy gets on the field and is flashing, especially if the sample becomes big enough to where, like you mentioned, Terry McLaurin, I think Kadarius Toney is another good example of this, where like it gets to a point where you can just extrapolate over the course of like just tack on another 3 or 4 games and put the production at like really disappointing levels. And then now you're looking at like a 6 or an 8 game stretch. And if that production's impressive, then like the guy's going to have a lot of value the following year. People are going to be touting him as a breakout candidate. Like, make the sample bigger and see what that does. And in a lot of cases, like Terry McLaurin's case, like he was on such an insane pace early in his rookie season that, you could go ahead and do that. And it's like, at worst, this guy's going to be like, a 7th round dynasty startup pick. So, you should be, if you can get this guy for like an early 2nd round rookie pick, do it now, because he's going to ultimately be more expensive. I think Toney kind of had a similar, revelatory type of beginning to his season once he actually got on the field.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because I do think sometimes there's a tendency to be like, oh, well, that was an outlier. These guys aren't going to continue that pace. But it's like, okay, those stats still count. Yes, we should take into account the sample size, but just sort of arbitrarily increasing the sample size with average to below average production, you can kind of really see like the outsized impact that those games had, and that there must be like some signal there. We'll jump to Chase to start right now. I've got the FFPC best ball ADP up for these guys positionally to look at as we go through this. And Jamar Chase, FFPC wide receiver 2 right now. I think our ETR ranks slightly behind that, but it's like really hard to argue, some of these top 3-4 wide receivers, quite frankly. And Not a ton to say about Chase just because he was so good. Like, I mean, he's clearly a top 5 guy. The thing that sticks out to me when I was looking at some of our underlying metrics was his combination of ADOT and Yak is just like absurdly rare. And if you look at even in this class, his average depth to target was 12.9. Looking at, we've got 10 receivers we're going to look at today, and he was second among that group. And he was basically tied with Rondale Moore in Yak per reception at 7.8. Rondale Moore was at 7.9. Chase did that with a ADOT over 12, and Rondale Moore did that with an ADOT just over 1. So, like, just utterly absurd. And it makes me think of, when Ben Gretch talks about AJ Brown a lot, and he talks about, like, it's tough to see this guy failing because he can get there in so many ways. He can catch a deep pass. He can take a screen to the house. So, just an awesome rookie campaign for Ja'Marr Chase.
Yeah, and Yak is correlated with negatively with ADOT. So to be able to, it's the AJ Brown thing. It's like if you can be a deep threat and dominant after the catch, it's unstoppable. And that's the thing with Ja'Marr Chase too. To the rookie prospect stuff, I think sometimes we're like, who is this guy? Like, how is he actually he's not a big receiver. He's not lightning quick. Like but just being like really, really good is helpful. And Ja'Marr Chase crushed in college in terms of the production, hyper efficient in yards per out run in college, which is another thing I really like to look at. Immediately comes in and delivers just an absurd season. He had 11.5 yards per target, which is way above what you would expect given his ADOT. He was used downfield, but not like really far downfield at 12.9 average depth of target. That's pretty much like, I would say, a classic number 1 wide receiver type of ADOT where you're getting some deep targets, you're getting some shallow targets. You're not like a true deep threat, but you're also not an underneath guy. And to pair that with like an off the charts yards per target is frankly unsustainable. Like, you won't be able to do that again. But, target per route run of 21.2%, I think we could see that come up. I think that could easily be up to like 24%, something like that. You could easily see him have another season like he just had with an elite yards per route run of 2.44. The connection with Burrow is obviously great. The offensive line looks like it's coming together a little bit better. And then like the T. Higgins, the fact that he's also potentially a star, but I think he is a star, potentially a superstar. I think that's good for Ja'Marr Chase ultimately, where this offense is just going to have to lean into that more and more over time, and just they're just going to crush people with these huge passing games. Maybe it won't be as consistent as we like, but yeah, Ja'Marr Chase is set up for a ton of success.
Yeah, I think the concerns with teammate target share for me just come into play like when it starts to get really crowded. If there's like three other options, or if you're playing with maybe a Devontae Adams type who's going to put up like a 30% target share, but you got 2 guys that can be pretty efficient at 25% target share. And as you said, the offensive line improvements there. They may throw more aggressively. I feel like we're always saying that, but they may do it, which would just add pass attempts, pass volume, and make those target shares kind of like offset some of the regression and efficiency if you can see some more volume. Clear cut Dino wide receiver 1.
Yeah. I think Jefferson has a case, but I would take Chase.
Yeah, with tied to Burrow, I think is like, if you think it's close, like that's sort of a pretty tiebreaker. The next guy up in terms of FFPC wide receiver ADP, Jaylen Waddle. He's wide receiver 10. And this is a guy we want to talk about with the Tyreek Hill trade stuff. And before we talk, let's talk about his rookie year in general, and then we'll bring up like the context of this season. But, he was really a bit of a target hog there, especially late for Miami. And what do you think of his rookie season?
Yeah, I thought it was a very impressive rookie season. Waddle is, as a prospect, was kind of not quite boom bust, but definitely like a high ceiling guy with question marks, where he was very efficient really throughout his career in terms of yards per route run, off the charts in his final season, but only played 5 games. Didn't technically break out, but he played through an ankle injury, which lowered his yardage share in his final game. So had he just like sat out the national championship game, he would have broken out. So I think we should give him credit for that. And he's also, an underclassman, young player. playing with elite target competition at his time in Alabama. Maybe not elite from an NFL standpoint, but certainly elite target competition when you talk about what college wide receivers have to face with Smith, Henry Ruggs, and Jerry Jeudy there. Pretty wild. Plus Mechie was there, who might end up being like a second round pick with an ACL tear. So, definitely someone that was a really, really strong prospect, and then comes out, has, I would say, a good but not great rookie season, 1.75 yards per route run. Yards per target wasn't awesome at 7.4, but I don't think that's going to matter at all. I don't think the team is, questioning what they have in Waddle. I think they're very excited about him. Obviously, they're bringing in Tyreek Hill, but I don't think that really says anything about Waddle. I think they're, trying to add as many weapons as possible for Tua. Overall, I think it was a strong year. One of the underlying things that popped out to me with Waddle is that he was much stronger outside than in the slot. 2.3 on yards per route run outside. And Cedric Wilson's addition, I think, pretty much guarantees that he'll be outside in 3 wide receiver sets, at least for most of his routes. And a 3 wide receiver set with Tyreek Hill and then Jaylen Waddle outside, that looks pretty good. I think efficiency wise, we're going to get a really nice season from Waddle. Just comes down to Mike McDaniel's been hinting that he wants to run the ball, and now he's got a ton of target competition from Tyreek Hill. If this is a low volume efficiency type offense, like, is there some Brandon Ayuk level disappointment in our future if we take Waddle in the 5th round?
Yeah, Miami did have a high pass rate over expectation last season, if I'm remembering correctly. And McDaniel, coming from San Francisco, like, the negatives would be, San Francisco is pretty run heavy. Are they going to be run heavy? I think the positives would be a lot of that short 8-out stuff Waddle had with Miami. You'd expect the yak, like, I see a big improvement in the yak with McDaniel. And then Tyreek Hill would just help in that regard in terms of the space that he's clearing. And, a lot of the instant reactions to Tyreek coming to Miami is that it's not good for Waddle. I'm a little bit torn here. Maybe I'm like overly optimistic on Waddle, but I'm just not sure if it cuts into the target share that much. And I feel like it does just bolster the strength of the offense in general. And that, maybe it's a net negative, but I think it's like a very small net negative, maybe kind of like, Julio going, how we thought when Julio went to the Titans last year with AJ Brown, like, it kind of took off that 30% target share season off the table a little bit, or at least we thought heading in. And that's kind of the thing with Waddle, is like, we could have seen like an absurd target share for him, probably low to mid 20s now. But much better chance the offense is really rolling.
Yeah, and I think his ADP will probably end up being a little bit more realistic because it's going to get capped now. Like, you're not going to be able to talk yourself up to, Waddle at the 2-3 turn. And he did seem like one of those guys where, if Hill hadn't been traded there, we probably would have gotten to Waddle at the 2-3 turn. He's just, you just watch him. He's just super exciting. We never got measurables on him due to the injury, but it's like one of the few guys where it doesn't matter at all. No one needed them. The NFL didn't need them. We don't need them. You just watch him. He's kind of at another level speed wise. So I don't know. It feels like his ADP is going to be maybe a little bit more realistic in terms of reflecting the upside and downside. And so, like, in a weird way, I'll probably end up liking him a bit better after this move, just because I'm kind of going to be closer to where the market ends up.
Yeah. And especially for like Dynasty too, if we're taking the longer view, like, I don't think we want to get too bent out of shape over like a couple of percentage points in lost target share. Outside of Waddle, the next
for Dynasty, this could end up being pretty great.
Right.
Because like, if you think about it too, like what if Tua unlocks something here? Like, what if playing with Hill helps take his game? Because what we need from Tua is more downfield, the ability to more willingly throw downfield. Because Tua is like, it's not like he can't throw downfield. He just doesn't tend to very much. So if they get their offensive line in better shape, and now he's got an elite downfield weapon, and then you have Waddle developing into an elite downfield weapon, playing with Tyreek Hill, like, that seems like, a pretty nice path to him being like an awesome wide receiver in 2 or 3 years.
The next guy on our list, Amon-Ra St. Brown. He is FFPC wide receiver 23. he played much better than I expected. And just looking at some of these underlying metrics, it's like kind of crazy how closely he compares to Waddle in a lot of them. I mean, they're almost identical in terms of yards per route run, targets per route run, A dot, both of them right at 7 in terms of A dot. So they ended up being used like really similarly and being somewhat similarly productive. Amon-Ra came on huge towards the end of the season. He had, as I mentioned earlier, his last 6 games, he had a minimum of 8 catches in each game, which is, I mean, that's pretty absurd. We also saw late in the season him use like a little Debo-esque on the ground. I remembered it being more than it actually was. He was 761-1 on the ground for the year, which isn't like that. I mean, 7 rushing attempts isn't that much, but it seemed like that got tacked on a little bit more at the end of the year.
He's a guy that I'm struggling with a bit because, he wasn't a bad prospect, but he also, I mean, he was a 4th round pick, which just kind of makes things tougher, but he landed in a ton of opportunity. So like, even if you kind of say like, well, he's kind of really a 3rd round pick in terms of like the opportunity component of the draft position, I still think that he wasn't like, I think he was a worse prospect than Rondale Moore by a decent amount. I think he was a worse prospect than Terrace Marshall, who we'll get to. So he kind of fell into like the De'Ami Brown zone for me. And obviously very impressive rookie year, but now it seems like people are really buying into him and they're treating him like kind of the rest of these better prospects that also had strong years. And as a result, I'm a little bit more bearish on him. Like if I have to spend up to get Amon-Ra St. Brown as compared to, like a Devontae Smith, for example, I'd rather have Smith. But part of the reason that I'm not as willing to buy in is that he played 77% of his snaps in the slot. That's not a bad thing, like necessarily. That was actually part of the reason why he was pretty expensive in Dynasty after he was drafted, because people very clearly were like, Jared Goff's slot receiver is usually pretty valuable. So, it's not the worst thing in the world, but I do think in terms of taking that next step and becoming like an elite wide receiver, which is really what you're hoping for when you draft a wide receiver, even in this range. I'm not as optimistic on him. I also think like his situation could get a lot worse. I mean, just absolutely no target competition there last year. Hawkinson was injured, and DeAndre Swift was injured at various points, and I think that really helped kind of open up targets for him. Goff is also potentially not going. I mean, like they could draft a rookie quarterback this year, in the early 2nd round, or they could, maneuver and draft one in the 1st round even. So it just strikes me as kind of a fragile situation because you're really betting on his targets. And, he was pretty good in terms of yards per target and everything, but I just have less faith in him as a talent. He didn't show me enough to really make me change that opinion. 1.74 yards per route run. It's like a good season, but it's not like you should reconsider what you thought about this guy as an NFL talent type of season. And so, I'm moving up on where I would have been by quite a bit, but I still don't really consider him as like one of the premium breakout candidates from the 2021 class.
Yeah, him and probably Bateman are the 2 guys I think I'm struggling with most as to how to approach coming into this season. Recently, I've been on an Amon-Ra kick a little bit, where I don't know, I'm just trying to like give into that final production the last 6 games, but definitely bringing up some good points to make me question that a little bit. The last guy that's kind of in this tier as far as top 30 wide receivers in redraft ADP and also in startup ADP is Devonta Smith, who definitely seems like he has a higher ceiling than Amon-Ra St. Brown. And I put in our show notes, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Pat, but like I got a little Antonio Gibson vibe from Smith, where like Antonio Gibson we loved last year because we had seen him do a lot of the things we were worried about, but he didn't do the things we knew he was good at yet in terms of like his receiving ability. For Devonta Smith, I felt like he earned targets, at least maybe it's just my expectation, but I felt like he earned targets at a little bit higher rate than I expected, was able to stay on the field more than I thought. He was over 30 routes per game. His air yards per route run was awesome. In this class, the targets per route run, he was at 20%, which was about average. But when you kind of weight that towards air yards, he was near the top of the class at 1.95 weighted targets per route run. So I felt good about that, but we didn't see him convert a lot at those big plays that we know he can make in college. And, we saw that the efficiency wasn't necessarily super good. So I'm hoping we see that talent, that big play ability shine through a little bit more this year.
Yeah, I think he's a little tough as well. Partly because they're in enough of a dire situation at wide receiver outside of him that they kind of have to add another wide receiver, and it's a good wide receiver class. And I also wasn't quite as high on Devonta Smith as some others in terms of how good of a prospect he was. So if they were to add, let's say they add Garrett Wilson, I think Garrett Wilson's a better prospect than Smith by a decent margin, and probably going to end up being a better pro. So there's guys where he immediately becomes a wide receiver 2 in his own team. And part of the appeal is that, he can take a leap forward and just be a target dominator, at least at the wide receiver position, because Goddard will get his. But that concerns me a little bit. I also, he only had a career ADOT of 10.9 at Alabama, so he wasn't necessarily guaranteed to be a deep bet. And I also wonder, maybe he's not an NFL deep threat. I mean, he had a very much a deep threat ADOT last year, but that didn't lead to a ton of efficiency. 8.9 yards per target, which is pretty solid, but well below where you would expect for a 14.9 ADOT. 14.9 is pretty high. I think it would be kind of nice if they decided we need to get this guy involved a little bit more in the intermediate level. And that would potentially be one of the ways that he breaks out, where he's able to mix in enough big play, because he didn't embarrass himself as a big play threat at all. He just wasn't as consistent as we wanted. He didn't convert as many targets as we wanted. And Jalen Hurts obviously inconsistent himself. So if he gets mixed in more as an intermediate guy, and the guy they add is more of kind of a really solid secondary option, then, I think he has a pretty high ceiling. I just see him as having a higher ceiling than Amon-Ra St. Brown this year, even if I think there's plenty of paths to failure for Smith as well.
Yeah, it's a tough problem, because I know from a projection standpoint, we really didn't like Devonta Smith last season. And it's I feel we've made the adjustments where, he's more involved than we expected. And we're still pretty behind ADP from a pure projection standpoint on Devonta Smith. But there's part of me that's what if he hits these big plays? But I guess that's the question mark, right? My perspective when we started this conversation was, we know he can hit those big plays. Those will come, and you tack it on to what we saw last season, it's pretty good. But the counter to that's what you said, which is well, maybe he's just not going to hit those big plays as consistently as, maybe we dreamed about.
In fairness, his career yards per target at Alabama was 12.96, was 13. So, I mean, he was really efficient. I mean, Chase was at 13.3 in his yards per target in college. So if you want to talk about the guys who we thought were going to convert, I do think it's somewhat, it's he got targeted. He earned targets downfield at a higher rate than we thought he might be able to, but he didn't convert. But converting was kind of his thing in college. So I think the Antonio Gibson, type of comparison does work to some extent. And, he had issues as a prospect. He just didn't really do it until his senior year, but then he won the Heisman. So it's well, if you win the Heisman, we'll forgive you a little bit for the first 3 years. Yeah.
And the Alabama stuff is also always the teammates just are so absurd that it gets a little weird.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing with Smith compared to Amon-Ra St. Brown is if there's going to be one guy who's just so good that he just blows up all the projections, he makes all the math look silly, all the preseason math just look completely off. I think it's more likely to be Devonta Smith.
Yeah, Amon-Ra is definitely
pretty decent margin.
He's the projectable volume guy, right?
Right.
We're penciling him for a bunch of targets and a bunch of catches, so the median outcome on him looks pretty solid, and that's driving the ADP to an extent, which, isn't necessarily bad, but it's good to understand why guys project well or not, and like why the ADP is where and it's not. And looking at startup ADP here, before we move on to like the next grouping of the sophomores, but we're at a spot where startup ADP is somewhat similar between some of these guys. Devonta Smith's wide receiver 20. I'm looking at the Dynasty League Football startup ADP for March. So Smith, wide receiver 20, Garrett Wilson, wide receiver 19, Treylon Burks, wide receiver 15, and I missed, and Drake London, wide receiver 22. Like, where do you have Devonta Smith in with those three rookies?
That feels about right to me. Although maybe I would probably have Burks and Wilson closer. But yeah, that feels about right. I think Drake London's a guy who, like, also to me has some question marks. But he's probably I could probably have London ahead of him depending on where he ends up landing.
Yeah, and of course, the one guy I forgot to mark down on our outline, Elijah Moore. I was like, I know I'm forgetting somebody. Elijah Moore, he is wide receiver 15 in FFPC ADP. So he's actually the third highest. He's behind Jaylen Waddle, kind of sandwiched in between Jaylen Waddle and Amon-Ra St. Brown. And Moore, I know he's someone we had stashed on our NFFC Ultimate team that did pretty well last year. And we were kind of bummed out when he missed the playoffs because he was really breaking out towards the end of the season. Where do you have him ranked in dynasty value among the year 2 wide receivers?
I'm a little bit more excited about Elijah Moore than Devonta Smith, and I'm like way more excited about Moore than Amon-Ra St. Brown. Just because like Moore, I think he was a better prospect than Amon-Ra St. Brown. He was a really strong prospect, and I think he was one of those guys where like the numbers were telling me that I should like him more than I did, and I was sort of like, "What do you know, numbers? Like this guy's too small." He's really small, and it was like one of the criticisms of the class as a whole is that it's a bunch of small guys, and he's small. He measured 5'9.5", weighed 178 at his pro day. Devonta Smith, another really small wide receiver, only 174. But Moore was like, with the height as well, is he just going to be kind of a slot guy? But no, I mean, he can play outside. He can move around. Like he can do both. You don't have to have him manning the slot, which obviously the Jets agree with because they just re-signed Braxton Berrios. You don't make that move if you plan to have Elijah Moore in the slot. I think he's ultimately going to be kind of a Z wide receiver. And that's pretty nice because it gives you access to more routes. If you're going to be running 95% of the routes or more, you're going to need to be able to play outside at least some. And that I think will probably ultimately be where he plays the most. But, this is a wide receiver who was an early declare, which Anthony has talked about and shown as being really important. He was really productive, 29% yardage share over his 3-year career. And he was also very efficient in yards per route run. So there's really, he was extremely efficient. He was also way more efficient than his teammates, which is another thing I like to look at with, some of these schools just having a huge leg up on some of the other schools. So a lot of reasons to like him. And then he had another one of these good, not great type of seasons from him where he had 1.75 yards per route run. It's him, Smith, and Amon-Ra St. Brown had basically the same season by yards per route run. But for me, stay the course with Elijah Moore as I look, more into his prospect profile and, pairing it with the rookie season. Stay the course means this guy could blow up as a sophomore. It really just comes down to, does Zach Wilson have it in him to support a high-end wide receiver?
Yeah, and I'm a little worried about that from a redraft perspective. When I'm looking at Dynasty, taking the longer view, I'm a little bit more concerned just about the talent of the player, which, as you mentioned, like he's checking a lot of boxes. But from redraft perspective, I do think he's a little bit overdrafted right now at wide receiver 15, but it's tough. Like the mid-tier wide receivers this year, like rounds 3 through 6, I feel like are a little dicier than we had last season, maybe just early in the offseason. I'm going to talk myself into these guys because there's a range, like historically, it's just been so good for wide receivers. But I do feel like there's like a little bit of volatility in terms of where you can rank guys once you get outside the top 10. And so while I think Moore is a little bit overdrafted, it's like, wide receiver 15 feels high, but if you look at like the actual competition, you can definitely make some mental leaps there.
Yeah, and just to put some numbers to the slot stuff, he played 71% of his snaps out wide, 28% in the slot last year. And he had an 8 out of 12.4. So it's similar to the Chase 8 out, where you're seeing a mix of targets and starting to look like a number one wide receiver. I think also Davis being, I guess my concern would be like Davis is good enough to earn substantial target share, and the offense is probably not efficient enough to support him the same way the Dolphins offense might be able to support Waddle at like a 22% target share. So I'm with you. I think Moore is more exciting from a dynasty perspective, where I think it'll be maybe kind of like DJ Moore, where we're like, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And it kind of happens, but it doesn't really happen from a redraft perspective, but he does enough to make you kind of like check the box for that year and then get excited about the following year. I think that's
and there's enough volatility in the NFL that like, if he walks into a good quarterback, like, oh, Zach Wilson's good, or like in 2 years, the Jets, I don't know, trade for an awesome quarterback. It's like,
yeah,
which we thought maybe could happen for DJ Moore this season, and another offseason goes by and no dice.
DJ Moore getting re-signed to Carolina is one of the saddest things. That low key the saddest thing that happened all offseason.
And it's funny too to hear you mention, like, we were talking about like the receivers being small last year. When I did the prospect pod with Amico, I felt like there were 3 to 4 guys where like, when I was doing the research, it was like, these guys are big and they won with size in college, but we don't know if that'll translate to the NFL level. So it seems like a little bit the opposite of
the last coming
season. Out. But yeah, let's go to Kadarius Toney, because he was someone that we kind of we mocked this pick by the New York Giants. We were not giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I think, Dave Gettleman being in charge there was like not doing the pick.
I stand by not giving Dave Gettleman the benefit of the doubt. He didn't deserve it.
But yeah, the college production on Toney was like kind of non-existent. But man, he flashed, but he didn't play a ton. And again, so this is a guy that it's somewhat difficult to figure out, but the targets per out run was phenomenal. He led the class in targets per out run, and by like a somewhat decent margin at 27%. Now, he only ran 196 routes, which is almost 100 fewer than any of the other players that we're talking about. If you do the extrapolation, Pat, that you were talking about earlier in the show, like even if you regress like another 196 routes, like it looks pretty good. His targets per out run was good. His yards per out run was okay. His dynamic playmaking, like if you look at Pro Football Focus, they have a stat called, avoided tackles. And I adjusted that for avoided tackles per catch. And he was at like 31%. And I think Rondale Moore was at 22%. Jamar Chase was at 20%. And, Devonta Smith was at 16%. And nobody else was like really even much above 10%. So it was a nice combination of, he did the things that he was supposed to do, which is avoid tackles. And then he did things that we didn't think he would be able to do, which was earn targets at a pretty high clip.
Yeah, he was like kind of a revelation in terms of, seeing what he's actually doing on the field, because just like not a good prospect, like not the type of player who, I think should be selected in the first round based on their college resume. But these guys like surprise us all the time. And so I would say he falls a little bit short of the kind of throw out the prospect profile, but not that short. Like he's a sort of like, I'm kind of wavering on whether or not to throw out the prospect profile. The prospect profile, not good. He's a 4-year player. He was not productive as an underclassman at all. Earns his draft capital based on his senior year production, which is like one of the biggest red flags that you can have, because that's tends to be like how these players who don't end up being very good pros basically fool NFL teams. He was also not very efficient. He wasn't terribly inefficient in his senior year, but the yards per out run wasn't super strong. He was pretty good though on smaller samples earlier in his career in terms of the efficiency. And that was kind of the story of him from like the tape perspective as well. Like the highlights were incredible with Kadarius Toney, but it was a bit inconsistent. There was like some off the field question marks as well. And then he like bombs training camp. He's dealing with injury. It seems like, the coaches aren't really loving what they're getting out of him. And then he gets on the field and he looks awesome. And, if you take like his if you add on like another, if you take his routes up to 250, which adds over 50 routes, and just say like Kadarius just sat there and didn't do anything on those extra routes, he'd still have a yards per out run of 1.68, which is pretty good. So, he's kind of at a level. He's over 2 yards per route run, but on a smaller sample. If you had the yards per out run that he had on more, in more games on more routes, he would be the type of guy where I'd be like, it just doesn't, I just don't care. Kind of a Terry McLaurin situation where McLaurin, again, not a good prospect. Really, he was athletic and he was drafted in the 3rd round. That's why you liked him. Kadarius Toney was athletic and he was drafted in the 1st round. That's the reason to like him. But that's like enough. Like I have Kadarius Toney in Dynasty because he was heavily discounted because he didn't really have anything but draft position and athleticism. And sometimes that's enough. And I think in this case, it might be enough because we're seeing a player who can get open really, really well. And he can do it on the outside as well as in the slot. He played out wide on 38% of his snaps. He played in the slot on 60% of his snaps. When he came in, one of the biggest concerns was that he was going to be a manufactured touch guy, a slot receiver, but like maybe even too raw to play true slot receiver. Like he might just have to be kind of like, a Tavon Austin type. It looked pretty dire, but he comes in, he's playing on the outside and he's earned targets at a really high clip. Kind of looks like now maybe he's a more explosive version of Deontay Johnson, which is pretty enticing from a PPR perspective. I mean, that could put up a ton of points. So to me, like Toney's the guy to take chances on because, compared to like Amon-Ra where you need the situation, it's like, well, you also kind of have the situation because they got Brian Daboll here. Yeah, Daniel Jones is not a good quarterback, but he certainly could be good enough. Like he could be kind of the last legs Ben Roethlisberger to Kadarius Toney's Deontay Johnson and feed him targets. You're going to have smart coaching that's going to understand, hopefully, his skill set very well. I'm willing to believe in that. And, I think the target competition for Toney is certainly better than in Detroit, but it's not the type of thing that's, going to be really hard for him to overcome. He probably is playing in the slot most of the time with Shepard with his injury, and then Slayton and Galladay on the outside. But I would imagine he's playing in 2 wide receiver sets ahead of Slayton. So, if he's able to keep up that target per route run at all, I mean, he does have I think a really high ceiling this year.
Yeah, I think he's a really good trade candidate in Dynasty. I think whenever there's uncertainty, we tend to get, too attached to the priors to an extent. And there's a lot of uncertainty with Toney in 2 ways. One, first of all, the prior, as you said, is like he was heavily discounted to the point where someone like you who didn't even like him was drafting him in rookie drafts last year. So like the prior is not good in terms of the market. And then,
but he was a 1st round pick, which like really matters.
And the uncertainty. So we have uncertainty in that he was really good, but it was a very small sample and people don't really know what to do with it. We also have uncertainty in terms of the coaching shift, which like could be one of the biggest plus EV coaching shifts in like all of football this season, going from, Jason Garrett as your offensive coordinator, and Joe Judge, like the ridiculous head coach that they had
for a stretch.
Oh my goodness, to you and Davis with the all-timer calling Freddie Kitchens as like the Giants offensive coordinator was like the greatest thing of all time. But
we like didn't even know he was on the Giants at the time.
Yeah, so good. But Daboll's like a high pass rate over expectation guy. He got a lot. You'd be Josh Allen, his top 3 quarterback in the NFL, and Daboll was there that entire development. And Daniel Jones has some rushing chops, some raw ability. So yeah, I love just betting on the uncertainty here.
The other thing with Daniel Jones is that like the things he's bad at probably don't affect Toney. Like I don't have a ton of optimism for Kenny Galladay this season. Like I don't think that one season of Daboll, one off season of Daboll is going to be enough to have Daniel Jones like throwing downfield effectively. But I think he could be doing some stuff in the shallow to intermediate areas pretty well, or at least at high volume, and that's where Toney's going to be operating.
Yeah, and he's only wide receiver 41 in March startup ADP, which feels like, I mean, some guys that are around him are Christian Kirk, Gabriel Davis. I like Gabriel Davis quite a bit, but like I mean, if you're a rebuilding team and you want a guy whose value could jump a ton from one year to the next, taking a chance on Toney seems to make a lot of sense.
See, I'd rather have him than St. Brown. Like in Dynasty, I just straight up would rather have
Straight
Toney.
up.
Yeah. Because, I mean,
And
the situation for him is only going to get better, I mean, there's a lot of outs for it to get better. Whereas the Lions situation, I think, for St. Brown could get quite a bit worse. I mean, losing Goff is maybe this is a bad take because Goff's not very good, but I do think losing Goff would probably be bad for St. Brown specifically.
right, just because I mean the rapport was there, and I mean just like his value is being driven on earning those slot targets, and that could change with a different type of quarterback. Let's go to Rondale Moore, someone I loved coming into the season. Thought I was going to be doing tons of victory laps because he had a huge game early on, and it just didn't quite happen for Rondale Moore. And I'm just curious how you even evaluate him, Pat, with he had a 1.38 odd. So it's like targets per out run was great, 25%, but it's like does that lose some meaning when it's with a 1.38
Yes.
like
Yeah, it does.
and then like the good signs though are like they really haven't replaced Christian Kirk, like, and AJ Green's just continues to get older. That's how age works apparently.
Wasn't he a free agent?
I think he I have him like still penciled in there, but I think he is. Let me yeah, he's still a UFA right now. I guess I just kind of assumed he'd be back, but he is a UFA. They have not re-signed him. And I mean, if you look, it's DeAndre Hopkins, Rondale Moore, and nobody. I mean, I'm assuming Wesley's still on the team who played, but he's like, nothing. Pat just told me not to play Wesley in NFL DFS playoffs, and he scored 2 touchdowns. So it's no big deal.
That's true.
So so like what are you doing with Rondale?
I'm somewhat in on Rondale. I'm probably more in than not in on Rondale because the worst thing about Rondale, I think, from his rookie year is that DeAndre Hopkins goes down, and then the second round pick can't get on the field. That's not a good sign. Instead, they've got this guy Antoine Wesley playing ahead of him, who, as we know, is a great touchdown scorer, but not much beyond that. That was for you. But I think what it really said was that Christian Kirk was clearly their best wide receiver post DeAndre Hopkins going down, and that Christian Kirk was playing well out of the slot and had not played well in his 2 previous seasons when he was out wide primarily. He had played well as a rookie when he was also out of the slot. So I think that what Kingsbury was doing was figuring out a way to maximize his best weapon, keeping Christian Kirk in the slot. Whereas if you play Rondale Moore can't play on the outside. He's like way too small. It's just not going to work, especially as a rookie. Like, I don't know, maybe in year 4 or something, he'll figure that out. But for now, he's a slot wide receiver, and putting him out there means that you're going to have Christian Kirk basically out of position. So I don't hold it against Rondale Moore too much that Antoine Wesley was essentially playing over him, especially because I don't really see what else they're going to do now but play Rondale Moore. And,
right.
He did have 1.65 yards per route run, which is still good. One of the things with the ADOT component is that running backs don't tend to have very impressive yards per route run. If you're just running shallow routes, now I understand there's a difference between dump off routes and shallow wide receiver routes, but having a super low ADOT isn't necessarily good for your receiving efficiency. You'd rather have that up at a higher rate. And, the fact that Rondale Moore was able to have a pretty decent yards per route run, despite having a 1.3 ADOT, I think speaks decently well of, where he might end up, what he might end up being able to do as a rookie and what the team might actually think of him. So, for him, I would say it's one of those things where I'm definitely a little less excited about Rondale Moore. Partly, just the 1.3 ADOT, I think is a reason to be concerned about him, because another guy who looked like in a downside scenario, just kind of a gimmick player, and like being used that shallowly is definitely concerning. If the prior was that, he might be a manufactured touch guy. So, there's definitely some downside that basically they because they could draft somebody, he could get kind of rotated out. We've already seen them like lose faith pretty quickly with Andy Isabella. They cut Hakeem Butler very quickly. So you could see them kind of move on if they're not liking what they're getting out of Rondale Moore, but he is at a pretty decent discount. It's not like he's that expensive. I think the market as a whole is a bit spooked. So I have been drafting him some.
Yeah, I still like him. It just the discount, like you said, and sort of how Arizona lines up right now, it's like enough for me to give him a pass, where it just seems like, as you said, like it seems like they have to play him and that role could grow, but definitely question marks here for sure. He's FFPC wide receiver 49, right in between Rondale and Toney, and FFPC wide receiver ADP is Rashad Bateman, who I know you loved coming out. And I think one of the points of emphasis you made was like to not overthink, the situation when we have a talented prospect who got the draft capital that we were hoping to see out of him. And in some ways, that came to fruition, even though Bateman started off the year hurt, which, really wasn't his fault. We did see this Baltimore offense push way more aggressively throwing the football than they had in the past. We'll see if they're better this year, how much of that sticks. It does seem like it wasn't just a game script shift. It was like a conscious shift in the evolution of their offense, which makes it more appealing for like peripheral passing pieces to be able to get there. But the other hard part was like Marquise Brown had a really good year, which, does make it harder for like you've got Mark Andrews and Marquise Brown right there. So I'm talking all context stuff, but what do you think about Bateman?
Yeah, I think it was almost really, really nice for Bateman because we did get all the passing attempts, way more than we thought. And the NFL is just like really chaotic, where you sit there and you're like, on what universe are the Ravens going to just like see a huge spike in their pass attempts? Like, well, the universe where Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins get hurt, and they think that like Devonta Freeman is gonna fix that for them. So they passed a lot, but unfortunately, Bateman had a bit of a disappointing season in terms of yards per route run. He like borderline concerningly low. I think just above where I'd like start to be feeling queasy. 1.26 yards per route run, not very good, but not absolutely terrible. Didn't earn targets at a very high rate, 15.9% target per route run. Which isn't good. And he wasn't used that deep, only 9.6 ADOT. So like it'd be one thing if he was a deep threat with that target per route run, but he was not. So definitely some red flags about his rookie season. But at the same time, like I think it's probably good enough to where I'm sticking with my initial assessment of him. Like it's not like in the true danger zone, which we'll get to. For comparison, there, some other wide receivers that had similar yards per route run as rookies. DeAndre Hopkins had a 1.28 yards per route run as a rookie. Tyler Boyd was at 1.25. Now that Boyd comparison is maybe not very good for him because Boyd did not do anything as a sophomore. It took until his third season for him to do much. Robbie Anderson had a 1.29 yards per route run as a rookie. Kendrick Bourne 1.27, although again, that maybe not the best for him in his sophomore year. So he kind of profiles as a guy like from a dynasty perspective. I'm still very much in on Bateman, but the rookie season, I think, gives us like a pretty strong reason to be worried that it might not be this year. And
Yeah,
I think, and then you look at the overall context of the situation and it's like, well, there's a lot of reasons to think now it might not be this year. So I'm trying to, like, one of the reasons I have a decent amount of Toney is because Toney's going right there with Bateman. So I basically make myself take Toney about half the time. Whereas like a previous version of me might have just hammered Bateman every time.
yeah.
So that's one way to mix it up. I think Toney's got a huge ceiling, and so is a pretty appealing way to mix it up from Bateman. Also, the rookie wide receivers like Garrett Wilson tends to get drafted right by Bateman. That will probably change. I think Wilson's ADP will end up climbing well above Bateman, so I've been taking him a lot. Traylon Burks, you can sometimes get there. Drake London. So I think Bateman should be in the mix, but there's definitely enough from his rookie season, enough from the overall context to make you think like, even if he emerges as a star, it could be a year or two from now.
Yeah. So in terms of dynasty value, he's wide receiver 32 right now, March ADP. You've got Jamison Williams at wide receiver 38, Olave at wide receiver 33. I know Amico thinks Olave is pretty overrated from a dynasty perspective, but like,
yeah, I'm not
kind of how are you? Yeah, so definitely ahead of Olave. What about him, like versus Jamison Williams? Like, if you were offered a trade, would you take Jamison Williams
in dynasty? I want. Well, Jamison Williams is probably going to end up on the Chiefs now or something, but
yeah, so not knowing where he lands.
Yeah, I mean, you seriously, like, you think about those wide receivers that are going in the late first round now.
Oh my God, someone's going to hit the jackpot.
Someone's in Chiefs and Packers. Yeah. So there's like, I think it like makes sense to just draft all those guys like a little higher than you otherwise pick.
That's a good because it's like Chiefs Packers is a plus to begin with. Now it's Chiefs minus Tyreek Hill and Packers minus Devon.
Yeah,
that's a really good point.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, I think Christian Watson. I think Sky Moore, who's probably a second round pick, but generated like some maybe late first round buzz based on his combine performance. I think basically anyone kind of that was seen as on that first round bubble, if you liked them already, you should probably bump up a little bit because one of them's going to get a huge. I mean, we went nuts for McCole Hardman. Guy's not even a wide receiver.
Second round pick with being blocked more than whoever lands there will be blocked.
And super raw as a prospect. I think whoever they take will probably be a much. This is a pretty good wide receiver class. So there's not a ton of guys who look like Tony's, where you're like draft position's the only reason I'm in. But anyway, I would still take Bateman over a guy like Jamison Williams is an awesome prospect, but he did tear his ACL in the national championship game. That's a problem. Also, from a dynasty perspective, let's say he doesn't go to the Chiefs. The most likely scenario is that he ends up having a very short and potentially not efficient rookie season. And so now you're looking at like a Bateman rookie season.
Yeah, where we didn't know he was hurt going in, but he ended up getting hurt.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you're looking at like, this guy, it's like, I think I'd rather take Bateman, who is not dealing with the ACL. He's going into this season healthy. But that's probably pretty fair because Williams is also a very strong prospect.
The rest of the guys, we don't have to go too in depth on, but just one of your thoughts. Three other guys I had written down was Josh Palmer, Nico Collins, Terrace Marshall. Terrace Marshall was someone I was pretty excited about, was taking him in the early second round in Superflex rookie drafts last offseason. He had just like an absolutely dreadful season. I was prepping for this podcast and I was like, we're way behind ADP on Marshall right now. And the ADP is not good to begin with. And I was checking with our team, like if that was right. Like Levitan's like, yes, it's right. I had to sweat a Terrace Marshall over and fucking Brandon Zylstra was on the field over him. So he was not pleased. The 0.5 yards per route run seems really, really bad. And he should have been able to play he did run 277 routes, but he should have played quite a bit. There wasn't, competition for that third wide receiver spot.
Yeah. And Marshall falls into the category of like, I think the most concerning category that you can have as a rookie is got on the field with no production to show for it. Like that's, what do you say to defend that? There's a stretch here I found the other day that's just unbelievable, where he had in week 9, he had 0 receptions on 1 target. Week 10, he had 0 receptions on 2 targets. Week 11, he had 0 receptions on 0 targets. Week 14, which was his next game played, he had 0 receptions on 0 targets. And he's out there. He ran 18 routes, 10 routes, 9 routes, 18 routes. It's just really, really concerning when a guy can't draw targets. I know the situation for him is pretty bad, and so I don't want to write him off as a player. He was an underclassman, kind of profiled as a guy who might be a bit raw, might be a bit boom bust. Played with Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase at LSU, but didn't really emerge until after they left. But it was like, you're kind of going, well, these guys are, and now we know how good they are. Like, you can't blame them too much for not being able to outplay Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. When he was a year behind Justin Jefferson, same age as Jamar Chase. But this rookie season was super concerning. I think, again, kind of the thing of like, okay, maybe he will do it, but probably not this year. And we have seen guys emerge from really bad starts. Devontae Adams, Tyler Boyd, who I mentioned before, those guys started really poorly. And then, Tyler Boyd over multiple seasons, it was looking pretty bad. But, but at the same time, it wasn't quite this bad. Where this is more JJ Arcega-Whiteside, where he had 0.54 yards per route run. JJ did in 2019 as a rookie, and that's basically where Terrace Marshall was at, and that's like kind of the like throw it all out. It's actually above where Terrace Marshall was at. He was at 0.5. So when you're that low and you have actually a decent sample, I think you're kind of throwing out the priors, and it's just like, I'm not really drafting this guy unless there was some really good situation. But the situation is arguably worse. Like, there's no outs to good quarterback play there, So, I mean, I have a hard time getting on board with him even as a dart throw. Although, like, DJ Chark kind of emerged after a really, really bad rookie season and had a breakout. But Marshall isn't really a deep threat, and he also can't be a target dominator because Moore is there. So it's very hard to see how it's this year.
He had a good preseason too, when we were all kind of like, yeah, it's happening. It didn't happen. Josh Palmer, not a very good prospect. His metrics are kind of meh, but he did seem like he emerged as like the clear third wide receiver by the end of the season, and maybe more from like redraft value, but it does seem like there's some upside here in terms of that he's in the correct type of offense. He does seem like he has contingent value if something happens to one of the guys that gets down. And then I'm torn with like, should we, not dock him too much for the targets per out run when you have Keenan Allen, Eckler, and Mike Williams, but like he's playing with those guys again this year. So
I think the contingent value point is why I like him. And I don't love him, but I think from like a dart throw perspective, I'm not sure he is who they thought he was. Like, I don't know that he was a pure deep threat in college. But we've seen guys be like pure deep threat. Like Chris Godwin was a deep threat in college. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to translate 1-to-1 in terms of your NFL skill set. He's got enough size, and he was decent enough where, like, I think he's more interesting if they need someone to replace Keenan Allen for a game or two, and I think he could get a decent amount of targets in that scenario. And I think, you have to give the targets per route run. I mean, there's more than one guy running a route on every play. So it's like, the target competition definitely affects that. He didn't profile as a very strong prospect. He didn't profile as like a terrible prospect, but just kind of like a scratch off type. And I think that's kind of what he is still, but it's a scratch off tied to Justin Herbert.
Yeah. And then anything on Nico Collins, who did get some opportunity for a pretty bad team, not a lot of competition in front of him. I know some people got hyped on, his sort of like athleticism last offseason. Seemed like it was a somewhat neutral year. How did you perceive it?
I think it was a little worse than neutral, in the sense that the average depth of target 11.6, didn't have a very strong season in terms of yards per out run, 1.24. So it wasn't kind of similar to the Bateman year, where it's like, you're not writing this guy off, but you should probably kind of bring him down a little bit, and then go with basically what you thought before the season. But Nico Collins was kind of like a highly athletic dart throw, whereas Bateman, was a very, very strong analytical prospect who went in the first round. So it's a little bit different. But, he does have a path to seeing targets there. I kind of like Brevin Jordan as a second year kind of guy. So I'm willing to take the project who might emerge in year two on the Texans. Brandon Cooks just absolutely dominated target share. Maybe that isn't quite the case this year if
Could get moved
Collins
too.
can emerge. That's true. He could totally get moved. I'm surprised he hasn't gotten moved. He would be a great fit on the Chiefs.
Yeah.
And
That's a good call.
let's make that happen. Yeah, I think Nico Collins, I mean, from a contingent value perspective as well, like, if Cooks were to miss a few games, Collins is really the only option. I guess like Chris Conley was seeing some targets last year, but Collins would certainly have a path to being like a number one type. And in that case, the 11.6 ADOT maybe is a good thing where he's getting used like, in the intermediate area as like kind of a number one outside guy. We don't necessarily need him to be a deep threat if, he has a chance to be the number one guy if Cooks is traded or hurt.
Yeah. One thing I want to look into is like bucketing wide receiver by like ADOT archetypes, but not like the final ADOT, but like just like the distribution of like all the individual air yards of target to see like, because there's some guys that might just be
like on a play-by-play perspective.
Yeah. Because you might be
Yeah.
peppered like 10 to 15 yards consistently, or you might be like screen pass, deep pass, like, and then that averages out to 11.
That's I think what Jamar Chase's thing, like, his ADOT is like, he's probably more of that deep threat who also gets screen passes rather than, some guys with that same ADOT are seeing a lot more intermediate stuff.
Right. Awesome. Well, this was great stuff, Pat. If you listened, you guys are definitely up to speed on the year 2 wide receivers and have some comparisons to some of the prospects in the class. Make sure you follow Pat at Pat Kerrane on Twitter. He's on Ship Chasing Wednesday nights with Peter Overset, Ben Gretch, and sometimes myself, as I will be on the show. Tonight, we'll draft a best ball team. That'll be fun. And you can follow his work over at NBC Sports Edge. Anything in particular you got going on, Pat?
Yeah, I'm working on prospect write-ups for all the position groups, but right now working on quarterbacks, and tomorrow have a podcast. We did a wide receiver deep dive a couple weeks ago with Anthony Miko, Davis Maddock, and Matthew Friedman. We're doing a quarterback deep dive tomorrow with Danny Kelly, Kevin Cole, and Rich Rebar. So that'll be fun. Wow. And doing Thursday at 4:00. We're rolling out those podcast episodes on A Good Football Show.
Awesome. That's a loaded podcast. I'll be able to discern whether or not I should use a first or second pick in Superflex rookie drafts on Malik Willis after I listen to that.
We'll talk about that.
All right. I'm excited for it. Check out my stuff over at Established Run. And again, whatever format you're listening to, make sure you like us, rate us, review us. Helps us continue these podcasts for free. Make sure you continue to check out Establish the Edge. This Friday, going to continue the Dynasty theme and look at running back prospects with JJ Zachariason. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.